there's also been some research into the time depth profiles of the dive. And we don't want to get bogged down too much in that. But as you're probably aware, in the early 2000s, there was this big trend in technical diving to use so-called bubble models for decompression, which imposed decompression stops that were a lot deeper than some of the more traditional approaches to decompression. And everybody got on board with that, including me, thought it was a great idea, but largely on the basis of theoretical attraction. It was never demonstrated in any practical way that those bubble models were better. And then about 10, 12 years ago, the US Navy, NEDU, published a study that suggested the opposite. And in fact, they weren't alone. There were several other studies that showed the same thing, that bubble models were imposing decompression stops that are actually too deep to be efficient. So during those decompression stops, some of your tissues were still absorbing inert gas. And that became a problem when you got to your shallower depths. And the bubble model decompressions actually had higher incidence of decompression sickness than the more traditional, what you might call shallow stop approaches. And so we've kind of backed away from bubble models now. We're in a sort of more intermediate zone with our initial decompression stops. They're not as deep as bubble models were prescribing. But there's another way, another evidence-based strategy that has emerged in the last sort of 10 or 15 years that has allowed us to adjust our practice to reduce risk in an evidence-based way.
Absolutely. So I assume you're referring out to gradient factors and adding a gradient factor to your overall dynamic of adjusting.
Yeah, well, gradient factors is one way of adjusting the emphasis you put on deep stops. So back in the deep stops craze, even if you didn't use bubble models, a lot of people were adjusting their gradient factors to impose very deep stops to make a gradient factor decompression look like a bubble model. And you know, in gradient factors, you choose two numbers. So the gradient factor low and the gradient factor high. So it might be, you know, in the bubble model days, that might have been something like 1090. So 10 is the number that controls the if you will, the depth of your deepest stop.
Sure. And
the lower that number, the deeper your deep stops are going to be. And then people backed away from that to some extent. So now people are using more like 50 or 60, 80 or 90.